Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will be about the third module of the Section 2 in the IBMS digital registration portfolio called Quality. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. I will then discuss evidence justification and some ideas for evidence candidate could use in this module. I will finish this video with some helpful tips to make candidate's portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the third module of the second section. These are the learning outcomes candidates should be able to meet when they have completed this module. They should be able to recognize the value of quality control, quality assurance, and clinical governance to ensure continual improvement. They should be able to identify and respond appropriately to abnormal outcomes from quality indicators. And they should be able to accurately and precisely perform calibration and quality control checks appropriate to their role. When they complete this module, they should come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that they have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. The task is, participate in a scheduled quality audit in your laboratory and review the audit outcomes to identify any impact on service and potential improvements. So let's break this down into smaller pieces. First part is asking the candidate to participate in a scheduled quality audit lab. Departments usually have their quality leads who oversee the overall quality needs and QMS. They might be able to tell the candidate when is the next quality audit so they could participate in it. The second part of the task is asking them to review the outcomes of this audit. Audit might have a list of things that need to be checked to see if correct procedures were followed. If those procedures were not followed, this would be a finding. Audit usually identifies several findings that then need to be addresses. So candidate's role here is to review the findings that were identified. Are they all from the same area of the lab? Are they staff, instrument or procedure related? The next part of the task is asking the candidate to identify any impact on the service. What impact do those findings have on the service they are providing? Candidate could consider false results, reliability of results, delayed results, lost results, and so on. What impacts would those findings have on the patient? They could consider wrong or missed diagnosis, wrong or delayed treatment, and so on. Last part of the task is asking them to identify potential improvement. What can the candidate suggest that would prevent those findings from occurring again? They could consider introduction of IQC, better training, regular equipment maintenance, and so on. This depends on what findings were identified during the audit. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. First information is telling the candidate to explain their role in quality audit. They could do this audit as part of their training to become an internal auditor, or they could be just shadowing, or they could be already trained and are performing audits on regular basis. Whatever their role in this, they should explain it well. The second part of the advice is asking them to use the original audit and produce a summary of the main findings. So what have they identified during the audit? Overall, how many findings were there? Have they occurred in the same area in the lab? What do they do? The next part of the advice is asking them to identify any of those findings that might affect the service delivery. For example, quality and safety of results generated, turnaround times, resources, and so on. The last part of the advice is asking the candidate to explain how those findings will be addressed, tracked, and managed to improve service delivery. What procedures are in place in your department that address audit findings? Candidate could consider CAPA equals corrective and preventive action, nonconformance, DATIX, root cause analysis, efficacy of corrective action, and so on. They could then consider how they would improve service delivery. Now let's talk about the SOPs that need to be met by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is, engage in evidence-based practice. Candidate needs to engage in evidence-based practice. Does the candidate know what is evidence-based practice? Do they engage in evidence-based practice? Do they perform tasks that are evidence-based? Candidate could consider decision-making approach, integration of current research evidence, clinical expertise, and patient values and preferences to improve care and outcome, the systemic process involving search for the best evidence, critically evaluating the evidence, integrating the evidence into practice, and evaluating the outcome of it. The second standard is, participate in quality management, including quality control, quality assurance, clinical governance, and the use of appropriate outcome measures. Candidate needs to participate in quality management. Does the candidate participate in quality management? Do they perform IQC? Do they participate in EQA? Do they perform audits? Do they know the key aspects of quality management? Candidate could consider governance, quality control and assurance to monitor, review and evaluate service, auditing to review processes against criteria to improve quality and outcome, risk management to identify and minimize risks, outcome measures to evaluate effectiveness of interventions introduced, their engagement in audits, using measures, participate in training, managing risks, seeking feedback, use of QC material before patient samples are tested, competence, equipment. Maintenance, IQC and EQA where applicable, expiry dates of solutions used, following SOPs, error reporting, professional standards, regulatory framework, relevant documentation, everyone's responsibility to participate in quality management. The third standard is, recognize the value of gathering and using data for quality assurance and improvement programs. Candidate needs to recognize the value of gathering and using data for quality. Does the candidate know what is quality assurance? Do they gather and use data for quality assurance? Do they know the value of quality assurance? Do they know what could happen if quality assurance was not in place? Candidate could consider enabling informed decision-making, proactive evidence-based improvements, proactive issue detection, measure of effectiveness, quantitative versus qualitative, creating a culture of learning, enabling accountability, compliance, transparency, accuracy, traceability, timeliness and consistency. Those are the standards candidate has to keep in mind when writing their mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidate's choice and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 8 HCPC standards. As the trainer, you need to set some tasks or questions for the candidate to complete that would allow them to meet the standards. If you download the module descriptors for the portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards that have to be met by those 2 pieces of choice evidence. The first standard is, gather and use feedback and information, including qualitative and quantitative data, to evaluate the responses of service users to their care. Candidate needs to be able to gather and use feedback and information from the servicers to evaluate their responses to their care. Can the candidate gather relevant information? Can they use this information to evaluate response of service users to their care? Can the candidate use various forms of information and feedback gathering? Candidate could consider surveys, questionnaires, interviews, reviews, data, complaints, anonymous options, accessible formats, using the gathered data for analyzing trends, identifying issues, planning actions, redesigning and improving service, update policies and procedures, monitor performance, closing the loop via notice boards and so on. The second standard is, monitor and systematically evaluate the quality of practice, and maintain an effective quality management and quality assurance process working towards continual improvement. Candidate needs to be able to monitor and evaluate the quality of practice. Can the candidate monitor quality of their practice? Participate in quality management? Do they strive to improve the service? Do they understand the importance of quality monitoring and evaluation? Do they use various methods to monitor the quality? Candidate could consider IQC, EQA, accreditation, ISO standards, documentation, SOPs, training, entrance, error management, audits, CAPA, nonconformance, ensuring safe and effective care, evidence-based and person-centered service, continual improvements and so on. The third standard is, evaluate care plans or intervention plans using recognized and appropriate outcome measures, in conjunction with the service user where possible, and revise the plans as necessary. Candidate needs to be able to evaluate and revise care or intervention plans by using appropriate outcome measures. Can the candidate effectively evaluate care or intervention plans? Do they use appropriate measures? Candidate could consider quality indicators, evidence-based measures, diagnostic accuracy, efficiency, standardization, safety, MDTs, EQAs, KPIs, crucial role of pathology in development and execution of patient care plans, providing essential diagnostic, prognostic and therapeutic information drives decision-making, contribution of the results generated by BMSs to care plans, MDTs, guiding therapy, monitoring progress of diseases, prognostic and predictive value of the results generated. Screening programs, cancer pathways, infection control, chronic disease monitoring and how they can be revised on pathology service, viewing care plan as a structured process of obtaining, analyzing and delivering high-quality diagnostic information that enables healthcare teams to provide effective, patient-centered care. The fourth standard is, select and apply quality and process control measures. Candidate needs to be able to select and apply quality and process control measures in their practice. Can the candidate select and apply various process control measures? Do they apply quality in their practice? Candidate could consider use of material, verification and validation process, calibration and maintenance of instruments, defined quality standards, standardization, variance, corrective action, continuous improvement, documentation and traceability, training and competence, IQC, EQA, KPIs, TATs, ISO standards and so on. The fifth standard is, identify and respond appropriately to abnormal outcomes from quality indicators. Candidate needs to be able to identify abnormal outcomes and respond appropriately. Can the candidate identify abnormal results? Do they respond appropriately when abnormal results are identified? Can they use interpret quality indicators and act appropriately? Candidate could consider accuracy, error rate, proficiency, reference ranges, control material, IQC, EQA, timelines, audits, trend analysis, process mapping, monitoring, statistics, responses like communication, investigation, root cause analysis, kappa, DATIX, improvements, training, feedback, monitoring, and so on. The sixth standard is, work with accuracy and precision. Candidate needs to work with accuracy and precision. Does the candidate work with accuracy and precision in their practice? Do they know the meaning and difference between accuracy and precision? Can they measure and ensure accuracy and precision in their practice? Candidate could consider sensitivity and specificity of tests, control material, IQC, EQA, SOPs, maintenance and calibration of equipment, training and competence, standardization, and so on. The seventh standard is, perform calibration and quality control checks. Candidate needs to perform calibration and quality control checks. Can the candidate perform calibration on various instruments? Do they perform quality control checks? Do they maintain documentation? Do they take appropriate actions if quality control checks fail? Candidate could consider equipment adjustment, use of reference or control material, traceable standards to ensure accuracy, monitoring performance, validation and verification process, documentation, traceability, frequency of procedures and so on. The eighth standard is, formulate specific and appropriate management plans including the setting of timescales. Candidate needs to be able to formulate specific and appropriate management plans and include in them relevant timescale. Does the candidate formulate quality management plans? Can they set appropriate timescale? Candidate could assessment, goal setting, action planning, roles and responsibilities, quality indicators, resources available, costs, setting up the timescale by immediate actions, follow-up, intermediate milestones and deadline for completion, kappa, nonconformance, DATIX. Those are the standards you have to keep in mind when creating questions or selecting tasks for the candidate to complete, as they all have to be met by the two pieces of choice evidence. One more thing that candidate has to include when choosing and writing their evidence. And that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want the candidate to do that piece of evidence. Ask the candidate to read IBMS justifications, as this can form the basis for how they should be justifying their choice of evidence. They should also include which specific standards were met in each evidence. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as the choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good and can meet several standards, which is what you need. And these are some examples of evidence types worth considering for this section as well. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make candidates' portfolio look really good. Ask them to try and present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs or even videos, if they can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in portfolios. Ask them to try and make it a little bit more interesting for the reader, which will be you the training officer and eventually the verifier. Ask them to try to put themselves in your shoes. How would they like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share my evidence I used for this module, back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also ask them to try and use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each module. They could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of them performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and indication evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Ask them to try and bring in their personality. Ask them to think about the ways they like to learn best to meet all the standards. And one more thing, ask them to keep the standards in mind when they are selecting their evidence. Good evidence will tick off several standards. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting questions, tasks, and guiding the candidate. Bye for now.